Hello and welcome to another video of all-time literary geniuses. My name is Aaron. So today we got a new and somewhat challenging poet to discuss. Is Samuel Wagan Watson really a literary genius? Samuel Wagan Watson is a contemporary Indigenous Australian poet known for his award-winning avant-garde raconteur. But does he really deserve the title of a literary genius, alongside William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and Jane Austen? Let's find out. Often Watson's poetry seems to have no grammar nor punctuation at all. Elsewhere, his poetry consists of long, stream-of-consciousness style paragraphs, leading to a wide criticism of his works. Because of this, many readers are unable to title Watson's work as genius. However, before we jump to any conclusions, let us first define what this key term, literary genius, really means. William Wordsworth, a founder of the Romantic period, wrote, "Of genius the only proof is the act of doing well what is worthy to be done, and what was never done before. Of genius in the fine arts, the only infallible sign is the widening sphere of human sensibility for the delight, honour, and benefit of human nature." What Wordsworth is really saying is three things. Firstly, true genius is demonstrated by performing an important and valuable task, especially when it's original. Secondly, it's marked by its ability to expand on a range of human emotions, perceptions, enhancing human experience for joy, dignity, and the betterment of mankind. That is really to make people aware and appreciative of life's richness. Thirdly, Wordsworth argues genius either introduces a completely new concept or idea, or it applies existing skills and knowledge to new areas in innovative ways. On top of this, I've added some of my own requirements based on universally accepted geniuses. It must appeal to a broad audience and must have a lasting influence, creating a legacy. In Ghosts of Boundary Street, Watson gives voice to feelings and emotions of a discriminated race, raising awareness and demanding important reforms. Around 1 in 12 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults are part of the stolen generations. Watson says that he really believes that there is not a single Indigenous figure who remains unimpacted by this stolen generation. At the time in which this text was first published, the first topic of issues which Indigenous Australians faced was of great contention. The white Australians were beginning to acknowledge the damage that they had inflicted upon Indigenous communities, as we know through the Paul Keating's Redfern speech in 1992, at which he acknowledged the harm done to Aboriginal Australians and pledged for reconciliation. So after so much damage has been done to the Indigenous identity, Watson adopts the task of rebuilding this identity. Much of the Indigenous identity is based on storytelling, the Dreamtime being the pinnacle example of this. The structure and content of this poems is a way in which Watson renews his Indigenous storytelling and consequently his Bira Gubba identity. With this in mind, the stream of consciousness style employed by Watson is no longer a flaw, but rather a stylistic feature of Dreamtime storytelling. The overall atmosphere created by Watson is one of a dreamlike trance, especially at the start of the poem. This is largely due to the Australian landscape created by Watson's imagery. The sun is depicted with the anthropomorphism of loud and with a spiraling helix. Moreover, parallels are drawn to the exotic dancers are outside of reach, as well as a drunkard and a hungover state to add a haze around the poem. This haze corresponds to the ambiguous nature of the Dreamtime. Moreover, as a stream of consciousness poem, Watson manages to depict his thoughts while simultaneously portraying poetic beauty and narrative qualities. These dreamlike stories were traditionally told in the form of a corroboree. This ritual was an emotional bond to the land in which stories were told in the form of song and dance. Three qualities which Watson portrays in his micro-corroboree, Ghosts of Boundary Street. Watson's stream of consciousness style in his poetry revives dreamlike storytelling, rebuilding indigenous identity. Watson continues to depict his Birra identity as he separates himself from the whites. In the deserted streets, the spirits dance, inches above the bitumen. The spirits are dancing. This deathly image is directly linked to the ghosts mentioned in the title. But what are these spirits? Watson, like many Indigenous poets, used the spirits to describe their history and ancestry. Indigenous history is rooted in their Dreamtime theology. The Dreamtime to them is not a physical period or idea easily embodied. Rather, it is a dreamlike, spirit-like history in storytelling and remembrance of their ancestors. Although a remembrance, the Dreamtime is an eternal concept, living as long as the Indigenous exist. Thus, the spiraling dancing is not only a link to Watson's elders' relationship to the urban segregation, but also his very own spirit hovering above those streets. Employing his poem as a means to express himself through the Dreamtime experience, Watson raises awareness for the segregated Indigenous. Does Watson perform an important and valuable task? I think we have to say, yes, he does. Does Watson appeal to a broad audience? Based on the previous argument, Watson definitely appeals to an audience of Indigenous Australians struggling to find their identity. But this audience is fairly small, limited to only one people and culture. What aspects of Watson's poetry appeal to a broader, even universal audience? Elements of Watson's satirical humour appeal to an audience broader than Australia. The clear Australian setting is only established in the 12th or so line with the reference to Brisbane. Before this, the setting is universal, a New Year's public holiday. In the early stages of his poem, Watson appeals to a broader audience as he humorously depicts the failed New Year's resolutions with the metaphor of a cinder, a half-burnt coal. He also broadens his audience by creating a multifaceted environment. The alliteration of lounging lizards at the same time clearly serves an animal metaphor for people. The reptile having a significant link to the lurking snake of biblical imagery symbolized the devil within individuals. This technique Watson employs to appeal to an indoor and outdoor culture of people, merging the two environments. This relatable setting reaches its peak when Watson continues the holiday spirit in the lines, "The siesta of New Year's Day, the only moment on the Australian social calendar when every citizen is almost equal. Hungover, we are united." The line originally portrays itself as strange, being united through a hangover. However, Watson crafts the irony of the line to comment on social equality. In relation to the rest of the poem, the line says that the Indigenous people can finally experience a form of equality with the Occident when both are brought to their lowest in drunkenness. In relation to appealing to an audience, however, Watson gives this line a second purpose. His story of the experience of a segregated persona is linked to nearly every reader with a relatable hungover experience. Hungover, at the very worst, Watson states, every individual, despite their culture or race, is equal, or almost equal, as he pointedly states. Thus, the Indigenous experience is linked to the experience of a broader audience. Another of Wordsworth's guidelines to genius was the ability to develop emotions with the result of the betterment of society. Psychoanalyzing Watson, we can use his poems to understand his emotions regarding racial segregation. Watson writes, "Trekking down Boundary Street, West End, Brisbane, the residue of Moet on my forehead." The term trekking suggests a difficulty the persona experiences despite the implied short distance. This difficulty can be attributed to the nature of the street. Boundary streets are borders of the inner city. An Aboriginal wasn't allowed past the boundary street after 4 p.m. Remembering Watson's earlier specification on the setting in the post-meridian sun, as well as the siesta as a cultural reference to a lazy afternoon, that is the exact period in which the persona treks down Boundary Street. Thus, we can imagine an indigenous persona walking down the very symbol of racial segregation at a time where he is historically not meant to be there. Watson adopts a seemingly strange obsession with boundary streets as an extended metaphor in his poetry anthology Smoke Encrypted Whispers. Watson states in an interview, "That name, that is, Boundary Street, is written into the blood of our people," and later, "To remove that name will be a washing away the blood and history of our people." Watson believes emotionally remembering and confronting Australia's segregationist history, as exemplified by the Boundary Street, is of vital importance. Watson further expands on the Indigenous experience and relationship with urban life when he writes in the first lines, "The deserted streets, spirits dancing, inches above the bitumen." The urban streets, symbolizing white Europeans who established the segregation, are depicted with a hazy heat. He writes, "The sun was loud, but bland as yesterday." The personification of the sun being loud, combined with its contrast to being bland, depicts Watson's view on the white. The dizzying heat imagery Watson creates emphasizes the incohesive stream of consciousness style, leaving me, as a reader, uncomfortable. This discomfort is then directly placed onto the white separationists whom Watson describes. This uncomfortable imagery is not uncommon among modernist poetry. Watson extends the discomfort when he depicts the hungover state of the persona with Moet on his forehead, Moet being a luxury alcohol contrasting his hungover state. The sweaty, unlikable imagery, especially when applied to the persona as a protagonist, increases my, and I assume the broader audience's, discomfort. So does Watson enhance human experiences by expanding on emotions? Yes, he sure does. The last of our literary criteria for a genius is that the poet must have a lasting influence, creating a legacy. The writers who left behind the most important literary works influenced their peers, started a literary movement, and took bold steps towards new form and writing. Those are the poets that are best remembered and most commonly labelled as the greatest poem of all time. So, for Watson to be a genius, did he leave a legacy? Well, it's impossible to say so right now. Yes, based on Wordsworth's criteria, Watson shows promising signs of being a literary genius, but his poems have not yet withstood the test of time. If Watson's poetry is still read, studied, and enjoyed in a couple centuries' time, let history prove me wrong. But, for now, I cannot say that he is a literary genius. Now, I think I also need a coffee to pull me up. Until next time, so long.